Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. Thank you very much for joining us. Just checking, Michelle, you can see my screen okay?
Yes, see it. That looks great, Jess.
Brilliant. We'll just wait another half minute or so until all of the numbers trickle in, and then we will get right into it.
It's freezing down here in Melbourne today. The fog was amazing over Port Phillip Bay.
Yeah.
Crowding everything. It was lovely. Typical Melbourne winter's morning.
Okay, so not too much longer now. We've got a lot to cover.
Hopefully people are got themselves comfortable with a cup of tea or a coffee, ready to settle in for a discussion.
Okay, I think we might get started. So my name's Jessica Graham. I work for PRAXIS Australia as a project officer, and I am delighted to be helping facilitate today's session. So first and foremost, PRAXIS Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we gather and work on, and their connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. Our webinar series is generously supported by the following sponsors: Sophie Metham GCP, MTP Connect, the New South Wales Health Office for Health and Medical Research, SA Health Medical Education and Training Unit, and Health Translation SA. PRAXIS would like to express our most sincere thanks to these sponsors for their generous support. Without it, this simply wouldn't be possible. Okay, and just some general housekeeping. I'm sure you're all very much familiar with Zoom by now, probably over familiar, but anyway, it must be done. So point number one, your mic will be automatically set to mute. If there are more than one of you in an office viewing the session, please do use only one PC. That's to eliminate any interference we might get from that. Please also have your mobile phone set to silent. You can take a moment to do that now. And again, place your phone away from your PC. That's to avoid interference. There will be question time allocated at the end of the session, time permitting, of course. But feel free to ask questions throughout. You can type your questions in the Zoom Q&A box or the chat stream. It's preferable that you use the Q&A box just because it keeps it nice and organized, and it's efficient when I'm monitoring those streams and trying to bring up relevant points. But of course, if you don't have the Q&A function, then just contribute to the chat stream. If we don't get to all of the Q&A at the end of the session, our panelists will do their very best to answer your questions offline via email, and that might even work in your favor because you might get a more in-depth response that way. And now to introduce our topic, we will be looking at clinical trials and AI, opportunities and new frontiers today. The application of new and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence to improve the way we design and conduct clinical trials are rapidly building momentum, especially as an impact of COVID-19. Adoption of these new tools is critical to speeding up development timeframes and improving accessibility to all. But there are inherent risks that require careful consideration to ensure that we maintain robust ethical frameworks and ensure that the rights and well-being of the public are not compromised. We'll explore some of these today, as well as provide an overview of how AI can be used to improve our practice. And just a disclaimer as well, this webinar is designed to provide a forum for discussion of emerging issues across the sector. Therefore, the panelist views do not necessarily directly reflect the position of their organisations. We recommend that you consult with your sponsor or sponsor representative, HREC and RGO for study-specific advice at all times. Participant and staff safety and welfare is always the paramount concern. And now to introduce our wonderful panelist. Michelle Gallaher is a Melbourne-based award-winning entrepreneur, speaker and advocate for the Australian health technology sector and for women in science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. As CEO of OPIL Ltd, a company working at the intersection of social media, clinical trials, health data, and artificial intelligence, Michelle is a sought-after mentor, collaborator, media commentator, and influencer, particularly on the pace of advancement of emerging digital health technologies, the role of AI in health, the value of social media platforms, and the pivotal role of women in STEM industries. Her career spans working as an allied health clinician, an orthoptist in public hospitals working with vision impaired and head injury patients, through to biopharmaceutical executive roles, and finally leading tech startups, which is where you will now find her. Michelle has served and continues to serve as a non-executive director and advisor within universities, private and in public companies, not-for-profits, and on various government committees and boards throughout her career. She currently serves as a NED on Cancer Trials Australia, PRAXIS Australia, and the MedTech Actuator. Michelle is an accomplished speaker and media commentator, a master networker, and mother of 2 remarkable teenagers. She does not like cricket and never has. I will hand over to Michelle now to get underway with today's session. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Jess. I make no apology for not liking cricket, but I do like football, if that makes a difference. It's a real delight to be able to speak with you this morning, and I just want to say thank you at the outset for taking the time. I'm sure you're ridiculously busy, as many of us are in this industry at the moment, as we adapt and get set to be in this new business as unusual space. So today we want to talk about AI and clinical trials, and to give you a bit of background, it's an area that I've been really fascinated with probably for the last 2.5 to 3 years. So don't be concerned if you feel like this is your very first conversation about AI and clinical trials. I'm going to help you and sort of make sure you understand what AI and what the implication of AI might look like in clinical trials. So don't feel left behind, and be rest assured that many people that are working at the frontier of this industry are really literally only a few years in front of you, despite AI actually being around since the 1950s. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So bear with me just for a minute as I click through. So hopefully you can see that opening screen there right now. So as Jess introduced me, I lead a company called Opal. We're based in Melbourne, and we work at the intersection of social media, clinical trials, and AI. And our purpose is to try and solve the problems and navigate this new technology space ethically, in a position of transparency and trust. And we have a value system that states just because you can doesn't mean you should, but we'll get to that at the end of this conversation. So let me take you back a few steps and share with you what AI is all about. Right, hopefully you can see that second screen there. So what is artificial intelligence and how is it relevant to clinical trials? Well, I just want to explain artificial intelligence to you in this pretty simple way, and that is it's any task performed by a program or a machine that if a human carried out the same activity, we would say that human had to apply intelligence to make it happen. So Minsky and McCarthy were way back in the 1950s when artificial intelligence was first coined as a phrase. And there's been a number of computer science engineers that have worked around the opportunity of intelligent machines or intelligent systems, helping us to make decisions and to make sense of data in the world. And there's been periods in which artificial intelligence was so exciting and it was going to be the revolution. And then it went into decline and it just didn't deliver on the promise. But this is not different to a whole lot of other areas that particularly we work in. Comes to mind things like, stem cells. For years we talked about this and other sorts of therapies that they go through evolutions where they plateau and they escalate and then they plateau and escalate again. But a pretty significant thing happened probably around about the 70s and 80s, and that was the introduction of supercomputers and superior computing power and digital infrastructure. And we also saw in this space, we started to emerge in the 90s and early 2000, vast quantities of data. So with those two things, data sets and superior computing power, artificial intelligence really sort of was ignited again, and it came back up to the top. So this was kind of exciting for those engineers that were working in the space. And some of the early applications of artificial intelligence have been in areas like banking and insurance and government. And health has actually been one of the probably last frontiers to really see the introduction of artificial intelligence. I know, when I look back, I first started thinking about systems biology and big systems approaches, and that would have been about 2008, 2009. So this is an area that's emerging quite rapidly. And even though there's been generations of discussion around artificial intelligence, I think for now that it's really starting to see some rubber on the road around health. And I think that's kind of exciting. So just remember, it's those two big revolutions in computing power and real world data sets that has really given rise to the opportunity of artificial intelligence now. So artificial intelligence can be explained in this way. And I laugh because I like to break things down into pretty simple sort of steps, particularly when it's a new concept I'm trying to wrap my head around. So this is my version of what artificial intelligence is. And I need to qualify. I came from allied health, not computing science. I'm not an engineer. So I'm hoping that, my definition makes sense in a clinical framework, because I think, it's really the application of artificial intelligence that interests me more than the process or the engineering in the background. So for me, AI is really very much around the planning, the learning, the reasoning, the knowledge, representation, perception, motion, that's being able to move things in the environment, manipulation, social intelligence, and creativity. So they're very human traits. And this is the application of those very human traits into machines or into software or whatever it is, in being able to use those traits to augment or help us make decisions, or to automate or even create a robotic alternative for a lot of things that we need in our life and in our daily living routines. But really, artificial intelligence to me is simply just looking for patterns and relationships in data, combined with a systems approach, big computers, to ingest and sort, instruct, identify, or predict. And I guess for me, it's the predict part of artificial intelligence that really has piqued my interest in this space, because you think of it, the obvious thing is what we try and do with health all the time is try and predict, don't we? Try and predict the outcome, predict compliance, predict whether the drug or the therapy or the device will do what we think it should do. So I think prediction and trying to understand the future, that's a very human endeavor. We like to know what's going to happen next. I want to explain a couple of terms to you. So I'm not going to go into all the detail around artificial intelligence. There is so much language in this space. It's really mind-boggling. So keeping it fairly applied and relatively relevant to clinical trials, I want to explain what machine learning is. So many of you in this space might have heard the term machine learning. And it's a subset of AI that trains machines how to learn. And there's two types, there's supervised learning and unsupervised learning. So most of the machine learning applications that we see now in e-commerce or in banking or in lots of different industries, it's very much supervised learning. And it's a pretty simple concept, and that's really training a machine with huge data sets, and the human puts the input in, and it trains the machine to recognize similar characteristics. So that is supervised. The human is supervising the machine in that way. With unsupervised learning, that's a more advanced type of machine learning and a more advanced type of AI. And that's the concept where the machine could literally be trained by the human, but then start to see patterns and relationships in data that it hasn't been trained to see, that it becomes apparent to the machine that otherwise wouldn't be apparent to the human. So unsupervised learning is definitely the goal, and a lot of people are talking about this in the development circles that we're moving in at the moment. But the actual application of machine learning in the space right now is very much supervised. And I created this little arrow diagram to try and explain, this is the way I see it. that when we train an algorithm, and I use the example of something like a pituitary tumor and looking at images of pituitary tumors, that we can ask the question, can we identify pituitary tumors? And then we can collect all of the data, so that's all of the image files, and we train the algorithm by showing the algorithm this is a pituitary tumor. And even though it looks slightly different each time, and there's different characteristics, different measurements, different presentations, even maybe different file types, the algorithm starts to understand that's a pituitary tumor and it has variable characteristics on this scale. So then we try it out and we give the algorithm a piece of data, an image, and we say, is that a pituitary tumor? And the algorithm says either yes or no. Now, nobody's perfect, no human is perfect, and no machine is perfect. And so we collect the data. Was it correct? Was it incorrect? We use the feedback and it continues. So training an algorithm is a circular sort of opportunity here. The way I see it, it is anyway. And you've got to keep training it until we feel confident that the algorithm actually understands the patterns and the variation around the patterns there. So you can see that unsupervised learning would be, we train the algorithm to look at pituitary tumors, but then it starts to recognize characteristics that are outside the training scope. And that may or may not be valuable to us. And that's where the real advantage is in artificial intelligence.
Sorry, Michelle, just before you continue, we've got a great question in the Q&A from Alexandra. And so Alexandra asks, when there is talk of black box learning, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that's coming back to that. Thank you very much for that question. That's really cool. It's coming back to that idea of unsupervised learning. So we don't really understand how the machine learns that. We can't explain it. So there's quite a lot of that in this area. And that's the really interesting part of artificial intelligence, that they're so sophisticated, the systems that we're building, that we're starting to see the way that the machine is starting to learn on its own. And that's also the opportunity of the more data you feed in, the data also starts to train the algorithm. So deep learning or black box learning is very much around unsupervised learning. And that's that area of unexplainable learning that we actually, the engineers can't tell us how the machine has actually learnt that. And all we can see is the conclusions that the machine is making. And it's still up to humans to validate that over and over and over again. But there becomes a point where the machine is actually better at validating the data than the humans are. But keep your questions coming, because I really like being interrupted. So don't be shy to sort of jump forward and ask questions in the chat. I want to talk about natural language processing here, and that's making sense of language and responding. It was probably about 2007, 2006 that I started to see data analytics coming up, and this was actually around media monitoring, and this was using software to be able to ingest all of these newspaper articles. And natural language processing meant that the machine could read the content, read the copy, and look for keywords and look for patterns in that and make sense of it and analyze the sentiment of what those articles were about. And that blew my mind. That was about, it was about 2006, and I was working for the Australian Stem Cell Centre at the time. And we were trying to understand the debate around human research, research on human embryos. And this was a really extraordinary period of time, because I'd never seen sentiment analysis done on newspaper articles before. And in those days, we could only do newspaper articles. You couldn't do television or radio or images, but these days you can. So when you think about natural language processing, the idea of taking human language and not just looking for patterns, but understanding it, that's extraordinary when you think of how many languages there are in the world. So I was in China last year and relied on Google Translate. Have any of you used that? It's fantastic. It's not perfect, and that's kind of the funny part of it, but it's far more perfect than me at trying to speak Mandarin. But the lovely thing about that is we're seeing the application of natural language processing coming out in apps and all sorts of things that are really relevant, I think, around clinical trials, because it could also mean the translation of e-consent, for example, or it could be the translation of instructions, or the translation and the personalization of engagement opportunities with a participant. But natural language processing is a big area. It's a subset of artificial intelligence, and you'll hear this discussed all of the time. This is a really great little infographic that I took from Bold 360, which is a fantastic website that explains artificial intelligence and things like that. But I love this because I don't know about you, but during COVID, I've probably done a little bit too much shopping on the internet, and probably through things like Instagram, which are incredibly perceptive and very smart at adopting this sort of technology. But natural language processing is very much used in that context, where we'll ask, what is being sold. Machine learning looks at you determining the right response to that. Chatbots, if you've redone your health insurance lately, which I did, I ended up chatting to a health chatbot, and it was actually a really good experience. So each year we're seeing these kinds of technologies coming out in normal e-commerce situations that we're dealing with in our own lives, but are yet to see the application of these in a widespread way into clinical trials. But this is an area you'll continually hear conversation around.
So before, sorry, Michelle, before you move on from natural language processing, Gian just had a question relevant to it. So it was, is natural language processing the base of software used for qualitative analysis?
Yeah, to a large degree it is. Yeah, because it's making sense of sentiment. So it's often picking up, and normally natural language processing works really well when the data that you put into that machine is structured. So if it's typed, if it's put in an Excel spreadsheet, or if it's through, say, SurveyMonkey or something like that, if it's a recognized structured data set, it's very easy to analyze. But sometimes we're now looking at unstructured data sets. So this could be, and I'm thinking of the handwriting of some healthcare providers on paper, and that's very hard to translate into an artificial intelligence situation. So anything that's structured like an MRI, anything like pathology reports, biomarker data, anything like that is very much structured. So it is a very big part of it. So natural language processing is the foundation for most of the artificial intelligence applications that you will see at the moment in your working life. Keep those questions coming because I love them. I think it's great. And as I said at the start, this is very much an emerging area. So in me presenting this to you and listening to your questions, it's a learning opportunity for me as well. So I just wanted to sort of try and tie this down to the relevance to clinical trials. And I think AI is important because it automates repetitive learning and that pattern recognition. And you think about the vast quantity of data that we now collect in clinical trials, and many of you would have been in this space for years. And when you think back, one of my first roles in ophthalmology was collecting clinical trial data around glaucoma, and it was handwritten on a card. It was Department of Veterans Affairs, so it was on those funny little yellow cards. But I was collecting data in a structured way. But looking at all of that data, the human eye can't possibly see the patterns, not accurately. We can get a gut feel for the patterns, but we can't really see the patterns. And data gives us that really cool objective way of looking at data and being really clear and concise in creating evidence around what those patterns are. So there's a really great way to automate that learning and discovery process. And I think for the amount of data that we're collecting in clinical trials, we absolutely need this kind of firepower to make sense of it and to be really clear and precise around what those recommendations are at the end of the trial. It adds intelligence to existing products. And I give the example of Siri on the iPhone. So Siri also is a natural language processing application. So it's taking audio files, our voice. So I don't know about you, but I drive home and I get Siri to do all sorts of things for me. Siri's like my personal assistant. And now she's actually quite sassy every now and then. I'll say something like, I don't know where that file is. Find it for me, Siri. And she'll say, all right, be patient. I'm looking for the file. You know, that sort of thing is natural language processing. She's understanding what I'm asking for, but she's also adding a complexity around the language to improve the value of my iPhone by creating other features for me. So she reads to me my text messages. She helps me to send messages to somebody so as I don't touch the phone. I can do it through voice control. AI adapts through progressive learning algorithms to let data do the programming. And this comes down to the question that we had before about deep learning or unexplained learning or that unsupervised learning. So these learning systems are fascinating. So at Opal, we work a lot with social media data. So not just creating content, but we do a lot of listening, really intent listening on social media, particularly to patient populations and healthcare providers to really understand their lived experience. But many of you would know this if you're on Facebook. You get on Facebook and you've had that discussion somewhere about buying a caravan. And before you know it, on Facebook, there's caravans. And you think, that's a bit freaky. How did that happen? And that's because of this really deep neural networks that are being developed through AI, but also this progressive learning algorithm. What it also means is you've got to understand the relationships between somebody like Facebook and Google. So if you're on Google and you happen to be looking at a caravan, or on eBay looking at a caravan, those systems can often work in collaboration with each other. And then little tiny crumbs of that data combines to build a whole picture of you on your device. So that's where your device is looking and learning from your behaviors, and it's progressive over time. And people often say this, it's like Facebook knows me better than my partner. I don't actually think that's true, so don't take that as a fact statement, but it's kind of spooky sometimes how these kinds of platforms can start to know us really, really well. So I just want you to park your skepticism about Facebook to the side, and it's probably healthy skepticism because I share it with you. But also think about the application of a progressive learning system, and you're a patient with a complex condition, to be heard, to be understood, and to be seen. Potentially these platforms can ensure that our participants, or just in general patients, feel more heard in this system, feel more recognised. And it means potentially we could serve them up information through these platforms that are genuinely relevant. I remember, I can't remember who it was, I think it was Henry Ford said something about cars, and it's like, or no, it was Steve Jobs with Apple. And he said, you wouldn't want to ask the community, what do you want? Because nobody would have ever said, I want a phone that I could have in the car and walk around. It was not likely to happen. So the point is, sometimes our audience, whoever that audience is, or participants or patients or users, sometimes they actually don't know what they want. And so this is where artificial intelligence is trying to predict what we want based on our past behaviors. So this is the idea of progressive learning algorithms, and also the idea of deeper data using neural networks that have many hidden layers. And this is around predicting likes or predicting relationships. Police use this to try and predict relationships or connections between criminal gangs or networks or whatever it is. I have a friend that works at the Federal Police, and artificial intelligence is really critical in trying to predict and see what the potential relationships might look like between certain people in their database. So AI also can achieve this incredible accuracy through these deep neural networks that humans just otherwise wouldn't be able to put, 5 and 67 together to make 4. So AI gets the most out of data. So I certainly look at the vast lakes of data that we see now in the clinical trial setting and even in the healthcare setting. And to me, it's really exciting. And I know governments around the world, and particularly health departments, are saying, look, we've got all of this amazing data. We would really love organisations to come in and make the use of that data. That's not even sort of bringing artificial intelligence into it. It's just saying we're collecting data. And I know from years ago with the work that I've done with systems biologists and in that space, that the data that's being collected, particularly in the oncology space and particularly in Australia, is really deep and rich. And I think that's sort of seen the rise of systems biology for drug discovery and development rise up as a really significant new force around bioinformatics and data informatics in that space in discovery. But I think too, getting the most out of the data that we collect, and it's also that real world data. And I know that many of you know what real world data is, but many of those sources of data are objective. And I'm starting to think now about what about the more subjective and the more personalized lakes of data that are collected and created by patients, what they share to social media, the wearables that they use, the apps that they use, and integrating that data ethically and with consent. But how could we really leverage that data with all of the right frameworks, regulatory frameworks around it? How could we leverage that data to better understand our patients and offer more personalized solutions for them? So you can see why, yeah, I spend all day reading this sort of stuff, because it's completely fascinating. But I hope, like you, there's going to be some real questions popping in your head about yes, but, and yes, if. And at the end, we're going to have time to sort of ask some of those questions. And I've got a couple of poll questions I'm going to put out there to you as well.
Michelle, we've just got a question around patient confidentiality from Margaret. And Margaret asks, how do you protect patient confidentiality if AI is so pervasive that it has access to all personal data? And then we've got a follow-up question from Nick.
Margaret, that's the money question. And that's kind of the question that keeps me awake at night. And that's why, I have an approach around this, that just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think there's a significant role for legislation and regulation. And we know that legislation and regulation follows technology. But what I want to see is the gap closed between that. So in the past, we've seen sometimes years between technology emerging in life sciences in particular, and then legislation and regulation closing to create a confident and a safe and appropriate framework. I think privacy is the issue that I really wish all Australians were talking about more. We've seen in Europe the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, come down, and that was 2018. But still, there's countries like Australia that haven't quite caught up to that. So in some jurisdictions, there's actually really tight regulations and legislation around data privacy. But we've got to understand that a lot of artificial intelligence and the development in this space is coming up with functionality that we didn't expect. And that's a real problem for legislators and regulators. And I think particularly in the healthcare space, this is critical, because if we work outside the circle of trust, we lose so much more in this space. And I actually think banking is the same when it comes to your money and your health. Privacy is paramount. So keep that question in your mind, because this is the conversation we really need to have in this space, and not get carried away with the technology being able to solve a problem, but creating a much bigger problem over in the left field. But yeah, thanks for that question. There was another follow-up, Jess.
Yeah, so Nick asks, what are also the key ethical considerations and risk mitigation for organisations / companies that have access to such personal data?
Yeah, so we work with the Australian AI standards, and these standards, I have to say, only came out late last year. And that's, I guess I'm making a political comment here, but that's kind of the thing that worries me, that these things take too long to sort of get going. I think in terms of, creating those ethical frameworks, on the flip side, we shouldn't wait for government to do that. This is where individual organisations need to take responsibility for what they're doing. And I think when you look at small companies, and we're one in this space, our value system is critical to the trust relationship that we're hoping to have in the healthcare space. So I don't think, it's like wearing masks for COVID, I don't think we should be waiting for a government directive. I think we each need to be able to make risk assessments and to walk confidently but carefully into this space and take responsibility for what we're doing. You know, we've got to look at some of the really big players in artificial intelligence. And in these days, it's things like, you know, people like Google and Apple and Facebook. They're moving closer and closer into the clinical trial space at a pace that would probably shock you, because they see themselves as participants in clinical trials. So and I'm saying we because I'm putting myself, aligning myself with you in the clinical trial sector, I think we need to also be quite firm with these bigger companies to say, hey, you know, there's some rules, and these are the rules that we need to work within, but also to be mindful that the world is changing in a digital space. And so we need to adjust and adapt the spaces to respond. And I guess that's why I have a passion for Praxis as well, because I really feel there's a big conversation that needs to be had in clinical trials, but also in healthcare, around the appropriate use of AI and what are the frameworks we need to put in place and what sort of education do we need, particularly for medical researchers and for healthcare providers and those people that execute clinical trials. What's the education we need to put in place to ensure that we're working in a confident space here, but also respectful and appropriately too? Jumping back to the slides, and keep those questions coming because I really love them. Broadly speaking, AI has been more widely experimented with and adopted in drug discovery than we have in clinical development. And I think it's because drug discovery, frankly, is easier. And I think it's sort of relating to some of the questions that are coming out here, because I think your mindset's the same as mine. But it's been easier because it involves assays or it involves animal models. But when you're working with humans and you're working in an informed consent environment, and one in which there's a duty of care to those individuals that are participating in the trial, it's much harder in this space. So in some ways, I'm glad that health has been one of the last frontiers to see artificial intelligence come forward. I certainly don't want to push back on artificial intelligence because it's going to come into our space kind of whether we like it or not. But I think we need to be active participants in guiding the application of artificial intelligence, particularly in clinical trials, because I feel that if AI does damage in the clinical trial space, the reverberation across the healthcare system will be just massive, just massive. So I think it's really up to me and you individually and organisations like Praxis to play a very key role in this. But however, and this is the part where I'm naturally an innovator. I'm naturally a risk taker, and I know there's some of my team that are watching the webinar out there, and I know they're laughing in the background because they know that I like to push the envelope and I like to sort of see what it looks like on the other side of the door. The realization is AI can be applied in a multitude of ways, and it is being applied, and I'm going to introduce you to some of those applications now. But I know that it can add sustainable and tangible value to the drug or device development process, but also to the sector as a whole. So in health, many of us are quite, and reasonably so, conservative in our view, because our paramount priority is always around participant safety and appropriateness of care. But for a little minute, I want sort of to park that to one side and think about the opportunity, and then from there think about, so what do we need to put in place to ensure it's appropriate use in this sector. So this is very much my thinking here, and I think for me this is where I see the application of AI in clinical trials. And just to sort of qualify that some of this is actual, some of it's emerging, and some of this is imagined, and it's not necessarily going to go forward. But that's life in innovation, that not everything gets realized that you imagine that it could be. But I think there's a number of key areas here. And for me, there's sort of 5 key areas. Now, I'm not saying that this is the be all and end all. And I'm sure there's people in the audience here who are genuine experts in AI engineering, and you can probably come up with a whole lot of other things. But this is what I think. For me, I think the key areas are recruitment and selection, study design and conduct of the study, patient retention, data types and analysis methodologies, but also participant consent and engagement. And I'm just going to go through each of those areas and sort of pick out some of those key points. But I think around recruitment and selection, you know, electronic health records and disease registries are an extraordinarily valuable and super sensitive data set. Social media, so this is around patient reported outcome measures, or in social media terms, we call it user-generated content. But in a clinical setting, we also refer to it as patient-reported outcomes. And we know that patients report a lot of their healthcare status, their concerns, their experiences to social media. But we also know that social media, we can listen to it to really understand patient populations. Also matching apps. There's quite a lot of technology that's emerging and coming to market now, which is able to go into hospital records and particularly image files or pathology files, biomarker data, and look for matching patients. So there's lots of people looking to develop technologies that can support that recruitment and selection process. In study design, we're seeing the emergence, and this is probably only about a year, 18 months old. A lot of these companies are starting to develop and pop their head up around decision support software that is about predicting risk and predicting outcomes of clinical trials. This is an area that my company works in as well. But then there's others that are developing applications that are around monitoring and predicting the trial progression in that way. I think that's fascinating. And we're going to dig into that in a little bit more detail. There's a lot of AI around patient retention. I've seen some really clever apps that have been developed in Australia and others that were overseas. I was in San Francisco in January and was lucky enough to get into quite a big 2-day forum looking at artificial intelligence applications in healthcare. This was fascinating. And some of the areas that I think are really niche and really clever are around patient retention and those monitoring systems. It also gave the sense, I was looking at one application in January, and they were professing to give a sense of security to patients in that there was a chat bot that they could talk to at any time. It wasn't a phone number they could ring up if they felt uncomfortable or had a potential adverse event or needed to ask a question. It was a chat bot, and that chat bot was able to answer basic questions and also to know to escalate something to a real human if it needed to be done. But also we're seeing some applications looking at social and experience platforms around holding patients, particularly in very long-term trials that go over a couple of years. Patients want to be engaged on different levels now because we're seeing patients who are very digital and very capable and savvy in this space. Social and experience platforms, I think, are a really exciting area. We're also seeing a huge amount of work going into using AI to really perfect some of the data types that can come into the analysis opportunities, but also analysis methodologies. So this is again coming from that systems biology, that bioinformatics approach, and looking at some really sophisticated computing power in this space, but also looking at unstructured data and how we could pick up, you know, historic handwritten records that maybe go back, you know, 50, maybe even 100 years, who knows, and looking at sequencing a lot of that and looking at how things have changed over time. I love quite a few technologies that I've seen popping up looking at bias and correcting bias in clinical trials, correcting bias and removing identifying features from data, so as we're not selecting in a biased way, but also that we're not analysing data in a biased way. But remember back to the original discussion that I had at the start of this presentation about humans training algorithms. So bias is a really big issue in this area. But I think too, you look at how many people are using wearables and apps and all of those data types and integrating all of that data. I think that's fascinating, and it's a minefield. There are so many problems in that area about consent and integrating data, validating data in that space too. And then the final area that I'm really interested in is around participant consent and engagement. Looking at inclusion criteria, but also looking at that monitoring retention, predicting dropout. We're seeing quite a few technologies that are augmenting e-consent and helping participants understand the concept around the trial, what they're being asked to do, what the issues might be, how they're expected to participate, and what the obligation might be for them. So I'm enjoying seeing quite a lot of development and innovation in that space as well. So you can see a lot of my days sort of watching a lot of these companies as they start to emerge, but recruitment and selection and study design and conduct is the area that I'm particularly interested in with the collaborators that I work with. So I just wanted to dig into these areas for you, just to sort of share some of the knowledge and some of the thinking here, but also thinking about this is where a lot of investment is going. So again, when I was in San Francisco at JP Morgan in January, a lot of the venture capitalists were talking about the application of AI in clinical trials and were deeply interested in investing in this space. So there's a real appetite around this, which is another call to action for government and people that work in the legislative and regulatory space to be able to address and collaborate for this challenge. But around recruitment and selection, I just sort of wanted to pull this apart. And there's many of you who know what the challenges are. And you can see this shopping list of facts that I've got here on the page. And you sort of go, yeah, I know all that. There are people that work in AI and in engineering who don't necessarily know that. So I guess that's why I thought it'd be good to put it on the page. But this is certainly the way that investors are thinking. It's the way sponsors are thinking, that the problem to solve is around it's challenging to recruit the optimal number of patients. There's increasing competition for patients, and that's because lots of different trials in the one area, or a key opinion leader is recruiting for 2 or 3 trials, or it could be a rare disease space and there's only a limited number of patients, or there's an attitude or a sentiment within that patient population about participating in trials. But also the inclusion and exclusion criteria limits the pool. I'm telling many of you how to suck eggs here because I know this is your everyday. But the facts, these statistics, and these have come from a Deloitte study that was published last year. I think these are really concerning. MTP Connect also put out a fantastic paper around clinical trials and the challenges in the space. So you'll see lots and lots of references to these sort of statistics. But these are the statistics that sponsors and investors in this space are deeply concerned about, and that is the increasing cost of clinical trials over time, and that recruitment is probably the biggest hurdle and one of the most significant points of failure. So the gain is obvious. It's fast enrollment means fast completion. It means happy investors, happy patients. So what's AI doing in this space? So in this area here, there's a lot of mining of electronic health records and disease registries for eligible patients. Now, I'm keen not to highlight individual companies here because I don't want to bias your exploration of this sector. But in Australia, there's quite a few companies operating in mining electronic health records and disease registries, and this is a really fantastic approach. I think it's very appropriate as well. It means that a lot of that information can be validated, and just knowing who those patients are within our hospital systems and our care networks is really critical in being able to tap them on the shoulder. It really augments the process that's currently applied with doctors recommending patients or referring patients in. And I think, you know, doctors are under an awful lot of pressure as it is. To participate in trials is an extraordinary gift and a great opportunity for those doctors as well. But from a patient's perspective, it's not good enough. And many patients that we've spoken to, that I've spoken to, and some of the forums that I've hosted, particularly with GPs, there's a real frustration amongst patients that they don't know about these trial opportunities. So we're now seeing quite a few patient self-selection interfaces coming up. And these are apps that patients can come into and they can add their information, and it's usually a very basic amount of information about their healthcare status, and just really say the areas that they're interested in, even if they're not putting in their healthcare status. Social media is being used to identify patient populations. This is something that we do in our business. We recruit through social media, but also that deep listening to those patient populations and really understanding, are they ready for this? What's their sentiment towards participating in a research opportunity? AI approaches being used to assess risk and suitability. This is really interesting. So I've seen another company doing this just recently that's come out of the UK, and that's looking and trying to predict whether that patient is likely to comply, whether that patient is likely to drop out. And it's looking at a vast and a really diverse range of data sets to try and predict that outcome. But it gives each potential participant a recruitment score. And I think this is really interesting. We talked a little bit about the assisted e-consent process, again, using natural language processing and being able to offer different processes in different languages and more personalised approach to that. And optimizing the collection analysis of biomarker data, again, using objective validated data, but also thinking about biomarker data as sometimes the data that's being generated by the patient themselves through wearables, apps, or even, self-reported outcomes on social media, for example. I want to also look at study design and conduct. So these are the only two areas that I'm going to pull out for you because I'm just aware of time here and time for questions. But we know what the problems here are. Suboptimal study design is frequently blamed for failure to recruit, and the ripple effect of suboptimal study design is fundamental, isn't it? So the gain is successful completion and the advancement to the next phase and the increasing value to patients and not to mention sponsors. So the AI approaches in this area are really sophisticated and really interesting. And that is using and ingesting trial data to augment the design process. There was an amazing paper published last year by MIT, and it was looking at AI to predict the successful completion of the various phases in clinical trials. And that gave rise to a huge amount of activity in that space. It's a space that I'm really interested in. But also not just predicting the completion and progression, but being able to identify those enrolment targets. But the other thing that a lot of these platforms are doing now is ranking, and this could be a little bit uncomfortable, but ranking countries, sites, CROs, sponsors, and KOLs in therapy group and in drug or device classes. But that's giving that decision support augmentation to study designers so they can make more informed choices. And often I've been talking recently to quite a few study designers in big pharma. So much of it is based on relationships and experience and know-how. And you've got some study designers that are deeply experienced in one specific area. And that sort of experience, that very human knowledge, can't necessarily be replicated by machine learning or AI. But when you look at all of the data that's ever been collected about clinical trials and you're able to go back and investigate that data and look for patterns, the patterns are really extraordinary. So I've certainly seen some platforms starting to rank countries, for example, and sponsors on their ability to achieve a completion and then a successful registration of a product in certain classes. That sort of information would be fascinating for biotechs because it would change potentially their commercialization and partnering strategy if they could understand the success criteria of certain sponsors or CROs and sites for that matter in making better decisions. But you can see there's quite a list there of ongoing assessment of site performance, automate the sharing of data across multiple systems, adherence, tracking missed visits or gaps in participant data. Yes, I'm surprised actually that this technology is not more advanced in this space. But also, you know, looking at developing sections of the clinical trial report for submission using natural language processing. It is fascinating. If you start Googling in this area, you'll uncover all sorts of things because good content is starting to emerge. So just in wrapping up and sort of opening this up now for considerations and questions, you know, these are some of the questions that are in my mind. These are the things that keep me up at night and awake, sort of thinking about the opportunity and how I can participate to create solutions. But I think about the economic value proposition of AI in clinical trials. You know, the economic value proposition is actually quite complicated. It's not as obvious as it might seem, I don't think, because I think costs will go up and eventually they'll drop. You know, Moore's law of technology, that it will plateau and then it will start to drop as it becomes more obvious. But when I think about the cost savings that could potentially be achieved by using AI in clinical trials, I think there's also an ethical question of why wouldn't we use that? And if we don't use AI, we need to have a good reason not to use it. But it draws that real question in my mind around what are the ethics and consent implications of additional participant data, and how is that captured and stored and used? I think that was your question, Margaret. I think that is really, really relevant in this space. And I don't have an answer, and I don't know that anybody has an answer yet, but we need to have really open dialogue and conversation around this, but we need to act on it, not just talk about it. I think cyber risk is a massive issue in this area, and it worries me significantly that it's not the top of discussion when it comes to clinical trials and the use of AI across the healthcare system. Bias, yeah, trained by humans, that's a problem. We could correct bias with AI and potentially offer a more diverse and sustainable participant population, but understanding bias and understanding AI, I think, you know, people ask me about jobs of the future. I think there's a job of the future right there. I think in addressing bias and training algorithms, you know, thinking about people from called backgrounds or more remote or disadvantaged or vulnerable populations, people that don't speak English or don't have the same cognitive abilities as what some of us have in this space. I think the importance of bias in AI is critical. It's about as important as cyber risk. And I think too, AI could, and this seems like a strange statement to make in a you know, post-truth world where Facebook is dominating our news and serving up all sorts of rubbish to us. But I think AI really could empower us and create a greater sense of democracy if it's regulated properly and managed in a way in which privacy by design is the guiding force, and that as people like us in healthcare could really play a key role in ensuring that the appropriate application of AI is a key consideration. So I'm going to open it up for questions now. We have a couple of poll questions that I want, could you drop those in, Jess, now and get our audience to give us some answers? We talked about putting these polls up front, but I think you really needed to hear this conversation before you answer these questions.
Okay, I've just shared my screen. Can you see that, Michelle?
Yep, I can see that.
Great.
So the poll question number 1 is, will artificial intelligence predominantly, and I've underlined predominantly, A, B, C or D? A is augment roles in the clinical trial industry, replace roles in the clinical trial industry, create new roles in our sector, or not entirely sure but keen to learn more. We often talk about technology in this space, and I was writing a blog last night on exactly this, and it suddenly struck me that we talk about technology a lot, but we don't talk about skills and our ability to adapt to this space. Do we talk about our mindset enough? Are we ready? You know, in terms of I think we've got about 10,000 people that work in the clinical trial sector in Australia. You know, that is a considerable, extremely valuable workforce. You know, thinking about what the implication of AI might be on that workforce, particularly during and post-COVID, I think that's really interesting. So we'll just give you a minute or so just to answer that question. Oh, here we go. We've got quite a few people in. Augment, that's interesting. So most people are saying it will augment. And yeah, I'm kind of not entirely sure as well. I kind of want to say tick a few of those boxes. So that's great. Can we close that there, Jess? And let's have the second poll question. So the second poll question is, what area of AI use in clinical trials do you believe will require the greatest emphasis? And I've underlined greatest emphasis because I think it's all important. But in your mind, which one of those areas need to be addressed in order to address emerging and potential ethics considerations to ensure trust, transparency, and reduce bias? That question's biased, but you can see my emphasis here is around we need to work in a circle of trust and transparency, but we also need to recognize bias in this space. And that's one of my greatest criticisms of AI in any industry, is the people that are training these algorithms are systems engineers. And there's a particular demographic who do that job. I can't get away from the fact I'm also co-founder of Women in STEM Australia. So I'm a feminist and an advocate for women in STEM. And we see so much bias just inherent in our world. And at the moment, I certainly am very cognizant and aware of the bias of the people that are training these algorithms. I've got something to say about that. So I want to make sure that the right people are training the right algorithms here. So have we, we've got everybody in there too. Yeah, that's interesting. So we've got 45% said recruitment strategies, 32% said trial design, 45% said data analytics, and again, 12% are unsure but keen to understand. Thank you so much for giving us your opinion there. I think that's great. So let's open up the floor to a few questions. So we've only got a little bit of time left, but feel very welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you've got any other questions, send me a little message because I'd really love to continue the conversation. And I'm really keen to learn from people in your space who are working particularly at the coalface in clinical trials, how you think about this and what you'd like to see in the space. Have we got some questions there, Jess?
Yeah, we do. So the first one that I'll ask is from Margaret, and it's, how close do you think we are to an AI that can pass the Turing test, i.e. indistinguishable from human natural language?
So this is the question that I always tell scientists never to answer about when will we get a drug on market. So it's the same question you've just asked me. I don't want to say because I don't honestly know. I would like to think that we would see that coming when it comes. I know some people are sort of talking about 5 to 10 years, but also remember artificial intelligence has a history of promising a lot and not really delivering up until now. So I think you'll find a lot of people in the AI sector quite reluctant to answer that sort of a question, but it's a good question. I'm going to park my responses. I don't know.
Okay, so this one is from Jordanka. I hope I pronounced that right. So it's, what is your opinion on the recently published AI Ethics Principles 2020, if you've consumed that?
Yeah, I have. And I'm delighted that they've been published and delighted that they're there. What concerns me is how widely adopted will they be and how widely, how much is it going to be applied in the sector? I've worked in health all my life, and I think, it's nice to work within a code of conduct in which there are sanctions and that there are consequences for doing the right thing. I'd like to see more discussion about this, and I'm not looking at the media for this sort of thing. I think it needs to be discussed within industry-specific circles, and we need to explore what the application is to each industry. I'm a big proponent of legislation and regulation and creating frameworks which are useful and viable, and also not so tight that we strangle innovation in this space. I think having clarity around what the expectations of the community are really important in this. I also want to see a document like that as an organic document, not as a static document. But documents and I guess frameworks like that, I have a lot of faith in. What I don't know is how many people in the sector working in AI feel the same way. But I think there should be consequences. I think there should be sanctions. I think there should be an independent body. And of course, I'm going to advocate for a minister for artificial intelligence and the application of advanced technologies in Australia, because I just don't, or maybe a parliamentary secretary I'll go with, but I just feel that the Australian government, this is a great opportunity for them. And I think it's really important that we walk into this in a competitive way, but also in a really transparent and trustworthy way. Good question.
Great. Okay, so the next one's from Liam. He says, we're asking HREX to assess and support trials which use and will use more in the future AI. However, there is nothing in the national statement guiding HREX for how to go about this. How should we approach the issue of AI in clinical trials from a review board standpoint?
Yeah, wow. I love to have this conversation with you more offline, actually. Yeah, this is really important. I think this is where HREX and IRBs need to have experience on those committees or boards that have individuals with an understanding of the capability of AI, because I think the right questions are not being asked. And we know this from direct experience in my business, that when we have walked particular submissions through an HREC, I'm actually concerned that certain questions have not been asked. Having said that, though, it's not up to them asking the right questions too. It's up to organisations to be transparent in how they're using AI, because I think we all have an obligation to together to learn how the application of AI is playing out. I think this is really important. I think there really needs to be some deep consideration of the makeup of these committees and boards, and ensuring that that sort of skill set is there. And we need to encourage people with skills and knowledge in AI to participate in that way.
All right, so this one's from Chris. Does AI have the promise of speeding up drug trials, or even of having trials without humans?
Yes and yes. I think that's absolutely true. I think there's no doubt it will speed up drug trials. I think if you can speed up enrolment and make enrolment more accurate straight away, you've got a massive gain in that respect. I think in the analysis of data, we're getting more sophisticated and faster and more precise and accurate around looking at the data around trials. If AI can speed up the documentation of the report at the end, because that takes an enormous amount of time, then yeah, I think it is. I think the reason why pharma is investing in AI, and certainly venture capital, capitalists are investing in companies like mine, is because of that value proposition right there. I think, yes, we will come to a future in which clinical trials are run on data sets. And this is a really exciting conversation, and a really scary one too, is we still need informed consent. So even though it's not a human participant physically contributing in a clinical trial setting, using their data is equivalent. In my mind, there is no difference. We still have the same duty of care. We still have the same consent. What do you think? I'd be really keen to know what you think. If there's anyone in that space who would love to get into a conversation around that, I'd really love to talk to you.
Okay, so this one's from Amanda. She says, I have been learning robotic process automation, in brackets Blue Prism. Do you know of RPA being used in the clinical trials setting, or believe it will be in the future?
No, I don't. So yeah, I'd love it. Would you put in the chat if it is, or give me a link in the chat, or so the rest of our audience can maybe follow that through? Yeah, so this is a good example that I think we have to be really honest as experts in this area. We're not experts. This is very much an emerging and changing and shifting space. It's really exciting to network and to build relationships with people that are learning and using different technologies and applying it in different areas. So I love the fact that I can say I don't know. So yeah, keep them coming. I want to know now. So now I'm going to I might stalk you on LinkedIn.
Should we take one or two more questions, Michelle?
Maybe one or two more, and then we'll let people go. And it's been wonderful to have your company for an hour. Thank you to everyone who's stayed on the call.
Okay, sounds good. So Ricardo says, sure, there are many applications AI may have in clinical trials, but how would, for example, an SMO go about bringing an AI-related concept / solution to fruition?
What's an SMO? Scientific or medical officer? Ricardo, could you put that in the chat? What was the second question? And we'll come back to Ricardo's question.
Yeah. Oh, so Ricardo's replied and he says site management organization. So it's, but how would, for example, a site management organization go about bringing an AI related concept to fruition?
Oh, I love that. I love the fact that Ricardo's thinking about being entrepreneurial and very creative. I think that is way cool. Come and talk to me, Ricardo. But well, I think that's a big conversation. But I think, look, in Australia, and if you're in Melbourne or Sydney in particular, there's a number of digital health accelerators that would be really interested to talk to you about that. One of the things we see a lot of people coming from the AI industry who know how to use it because they're engineers or computer scientists, whatever, and then they go, oh, that could be applied in health. But we often don't have people coming from a clinical background walking forward. So understanding the clinical application and understanding the problem that needs to be solved is so important in generating new technologies in this sector. If you're interested in that, I would encourage you to look at the MedTech Actuator, and have a look at the Digital Health CRC, also look at Health and, so that's a digital health catalyst. The other one is, I think it's called Cicada in Sydney, and I think River Labs up in Brisbane actually had a digital health incubator. I know Advanced Queensland have some fantastic programs. Also have a look at things like Johnson & Johnson have a quickfire challenge. And so you only need to have a concept. So don't be concerned if you don't have an engineering head. You know, in a lot of the hackathons and a lot of those concept development programs that you see a lot of startups developing, you'll find that sort of talent. But that's great. That's really cool that you're thinking like that. That's great.
Okay, lucky last. So Anne asks, in Australia, we have no charter of human rights or Bill of Rights and limited processes and mechanisms for protection of human rights. Have you conducted an analysis of potential human right violations arising from IoT and AI?
No. So we're only a tiny startup here, but gee, I hope someone has, because I think that's really important, really important. I'd hazard a guess to say yes. I'm sure there would be somebody within the university sector. You know, I'm relieved to hear that these sort of questions are coming forward, because I think this is really critical in the dialogue that we need to have around this. But there will no doubt be significant human rights violations that have happened because of this technology. There is we know it already, because we know, Facebook is one of them, but we'll also see Google and Apple and all of the big Amazon, all of the big tech companies are certainly walking on very thin ice around this. They need to be held to account. And I think that's the role of regulators and government, but it's also the role of each one of us as citizens to be able to say, yeah, that's not on. We're not prepared to have that. But yeah, I'm like you. I want to see somebody do a deep analysis. I want somebody to show me the data, and I want those companies and organizations, big or small, not for profit, private sector, government, whatever, they need to be held to account.
Great, so that about wraps it up. Thank you so much, Michelle, for your time today, and thank you to our audience. We look forward to seeing you at the next session. Please send any questions through to info@praxisaustralia.com.au, and I wish you a happy rest of your day. Thank you and take care.
Thanks, everyone.